Hi everyone and welcome to the webinar of today. We will talk about MDR common changes, timeline for changes and the impact on manufacturers. My name is Sam Shakir, a certification project manager at LNE GMED North America. In the agenda of this webinar, we will go through introduction, origin of MDR, goal of MDR, summary of the main changes in the regulation, expected timeline for the changes to be implemented, also how manufacturers can prepare, and finally we'll give you some tips and conclusion. Now let's start with introduction. Going back to the origin of MDR. The MDR proposal started back in 2008 when the EU Commission triggered a consultation on the community's existing requirements covering medical devices. The plan was first released by the Commission in 2012 to modify the EU's medical device regulatory framework along with a proposed regulation replacing the following: Current Medical Device Directive 93/42 EEC, Directive on Active Implantable Medical Device 90/385 EEC, and finally the In Vitro Diagnostic Directive 98/79 EC. I'm sure a lot of you are asking, what is the goal of MDR? So the goal of the MDR, this regulation aims to ensure the smooth functioning of the internal market as regards medical devices, taking as a base a high level of protection of health for patients and users, and taking into account the small and medium-sized enterprises that are active in this sector. This regulation sets high standards of quality and safety for medical devices in order to meet common safety concerns as regards such products. The other goal of the MDR. The key elements of the existing regulatory approach, such as the supervision of notified bodies, conformity assessment procedures, clinical investigations and clinical evaluation, vigilance and market surveillance, should be significantly reinforced, whilst provisions ensuring transparency and traceability regarding medical devices should be introduced. This is to improve health and safety. Let us all go through the summary of the main changes in the regulation so we can identify what are these changes. So the first one, having wider, clearer scope of the products covered. What does that mean? The scope of the products will become broader to include medical devices which may not have the intended medical purpose, or include devices for the purpose of prognosis of the disease or any other health condition. The second changes in the clinical investigation for medical devices as part of the requirements of the clinical evaluation. The MDR will put in place a European regime for clinical investigations that will replace the diversity of member state regulation in the EU. Also, it will introduce many new concepts relating to clinical evaluation and clinical investigations, as well as a mandatory post-market clinical follow-up and periodic safety update reports. In this slide, I will be talking about the Periodic Safety Update Report, PSUR. Manufacturers of Class 2A, Class 2B, and Class 3 devices shall prepare a Periodic Safety Update Report, PSUR, for each device and where relevant for each category or group of devices, summarizing the results and conclusions of the analysis of the post-market surveillance data gathered as a result of the post-market surveillance plan, together with a rationale and description of any preventive and corrective actions taken. PSUR, Periodic Safety Update Report, shall set out the following: the conclusions of the benefit risk determination. The second point, the main findings of the PMCF, post-market clinical follow-up. And finally, the volume of sales of the device and an estimate evaluation of the size and other characteristics of the population using the device, and where practicable, the usage frequency of the device. In this slide, I will show you the frequency of updating PSUR, Periodic Safety Update Report. So manufacturers of Class 2B and Class 3 devices shall update the PSUR at least annually, except in the case of custom-made devices being part of the technical documentation as specified in Annexes 2 and 3. However, manufacturers of Class 2A devices shall update the PSUR when necessary and at least every 2 years. There is a very important tip in this slide for manufacturers to know that notified body shall review the report and add its evaluation to that electronic system with details of any action taken. Such PSUR and the evaluation by the notified body shall be made available to competent authorities through that electronic system upon request. Please note that with the new rules, manufacturers will need to perform the following. The first point here is gap analysis. To identify gaps in clinical evidence under new rules for devices currently on the market and perform the required update, since the compliance to current MedDevs without an update to the clinical strategy and performing the gap analysis will not be sufficient. This will require the following. So the first point, a thorough review of the manufacturer's clinical strategy and post-market clinical follow-up plans. The second point, manufacturers to conduct clinical performance along with providing evidence of safety and performance in accordance to the risk associated with the device. And finally, collect post-market clinical data. To continue with the summary of main changes in the regulation and to go through the third change in the regulation is having unique device identification, UDI, in order to improve the ability of the authorities and manufacturer to trace the specific devices through the supply chain and to smooth the recall process of medical devices that have been found to present a safety risk. The MDR mandates the use of unique device identification UDI mechanisms. The traceability of devices by means of a unique device identification system based on international guidance should significantly enhance the effectiveness of the post-market safety related activities for devices, which is owing to improved incident reporting, targeted field safety corrective actions, and better monitoring by competent authorities. It should also help to reduce medical errors and to fight against falsified devices. Use of the UDI system should also improve purchasing and waste disposal policies and stock management by health institutions and other economic operations, and where possible be compatible with other authentication systems already in place in those settings. There is a very important tip in this slide. The UDI system should apply to all devices placed on the market except custom-made devices. So the fourth point of the main changes in the regulation. One key aspect is fulfilling the objectives of this regulation is the creation of a European database on medical devices, EUDAMED. The purpose is to integrate different electronic systems to collate and process information regarding devices on the market and the relevant economic operators, certain aspects of conformity assessment, notified bodies, certificates, clinical investigations, vigilance, and market surveillance. So the European database on medical devices EUDAMED will enhance overall transparency, also provide better access to information for the public and healthcare professionals, and finally, to avoid multiple reporting requirements. The use of this European database, EURAMED, will enhance coordination between member states and to streamline and facilitate the flow of information between economic operators, notified bodies, or sponsors and member states, as well as between member states among themselves and with the Commission. The fifth point of the main changes in the regulation is the classification and conformity assessment. There will be an impact on the classification for certain medical devices. Reclassification of the medical devices to a higher risk class is possible. The MDR reclassification mainly impacting Class 3 implants. Class 3 if they come into contact with the spinal, according to Rule 8, and substance-based medical devices. The review of the lower risk devices will be highly enforced on clinical evaluation, so the manufacturer should do the following. Revisit the content of the current technical file, as there will be an impact on the existing quality systems, and to take into account the changes in the conformity assessment rules. Also, the regulation will feature new essential safety and performance requirements. To continue with the main changes in the regulation, the sixth point is impact on the post-market clinical follow-up, PMCF. This process will mainly drive the clinical performance evaluation and must be based on real-life data. Its results must be taken into account for clinical evaluation and risk management. The manufacturer will need to review their current post-market surveillance and vigilance procedures with evaluation linked to the review of the risk management and clinical evaluation. The post-market clinical follow-up plan shall include at least the general methods and procedures, such as gathering of clinical experience gained, feedback from users, screening of scientific literatures, and of other sources of clinical data. The specific methods and procedures of post-market clinical follow-up to be applied, such as evaluation of suitable registers or post-market clinical follow-up studies, a rationale for the appropriateness of the methods and procedures referred to in the points above, and also specific objectives to be addressed by the post-market clinical follow-up, an evaluation of the clinical data relating to equivalent or similar devices, and finally, a detailed and adequately justified time scheduled for the post-market clinical follow-up activities. For example, analysis of post-market clinical follow-up data and reporting to be undertaken by the manufacturers. So the manufacturers shall analyze the findings of the post-market clinical follow-up and document the results in the post-market clinical follow-up evaluation report that shall be part of the clinical evaluation report and the technical documentation. Two things I just want to bring the manufacturer's attention to. The field of intervention will be increased following the MDR. What I mean is unannounced audits along with product sample checks. Product testing will strengthen the EU's enforcement regime. Also, annual safety and performance reporting by device manufacturers will also be required in many cases. To continue with the main changes in the regulation, we will talk about the change number 7, specifications. Common specifications referred to as CS means a set of technical and or clinical requirements other than a standard that provides a means of complying with the legal obligations applicable to a device, process, or system. Where no harmonized standards exist, relevant harmonized standards are not sufficient, and if there is a need to address public health concerns by means of implementing acts, adopt common specifications in respect of the general safety and performance requirements. The change number 8 in the regulation is person responsible for regulatory compliance. At least one person must be assigned within the organization that should be responsible for all aspects of compliance with the requirements of the MDR. The qualifications of this individual must be documented and be available upon request. In this slide, I'll be talking about the expected timeline for the changes to be implemented. The timeline for the changes is dependent upon the successful conclusion of consultations between the EU Commission, the EU Parliament, and the EU Council. The final publication for both EU medical device and in vitro diagnostic regulations expected to be released no later than May 2017. Now let's go through some information to help the manufacturers prepare for the MDR and the changes. It's recommended that the manufacturers should be proactive by starting to consult their notified body in order to build a plan and evaluate the impact on manufacturer with gap analysis to identify all changes per the regulation. Early preparation and action from the manufacturer is the best way to assure smooth transition to the new requirements. The manufacturer should stay up to date with the MDR changes and with the whole process. It is expected from the manufacturer to be proactive by building a plan and evaluating the impact on its organization with gap analysis to identify all changes per the regulation. We are coming close to end the MDR portion of the webinar. I'll try to give some tips and conclusion to the manufacturers. So, number 1 tip, manufacturers will need carefully to review the new rules for each device group and define a strategy to comply with the new requirements. They need to start developing a transition plan for their devices currently on the market to be recertified under the new rules. Number 2, technical files will need to be revisited. Additional clinical evidence must be generated and declaration of conformity must be amended. Number 3, the manufacturers must be aware of some topics per the transition period. What are these topics? 1. Transitional period duration. When CE certificates issued under the current directives will expire. Number 4, manufacturers must check if their device fall under the new medical devices regulations. And number 5, manufacturers must check if a reclassification is needed. Number 6, manufacturers must follow the new conformity route assessment options and requirements, including Annex 1. And finally, the last point is manufacturing should start discussing with both the competent authority and the notified body about the changes. Thank you everyone for listening. I hope you learned from this webinar. My colleague Sheena Bond will continue talking about the IVDR regulation, changes and timelines. Thank you again and have a good day.
This portion of the webinar will focus on major changes and timelines manufacturers should be aware of in regard to the In Vitro Diagnostic Regulation. My name is Sheena Bond. I am a lead auditor for ISO 1345, ISO 9001, the Canadian Medical Device Regulations, the MDD, the IVDD, and I am an IVD specialist at GMed North America. I perform audits and assess technical documentation for Annex 2 devices. The finalization of the draft text marks the end of several years of intense discussions between the European Commission, the Council of the European Union, and the European Parliament. So now we have a final clear picture of the regulatory framework. First, we're going to revisit why the process for revising the current directives has really taken so long. And this will include a brief overview of the actors involved in the legislation process. Then we'll focus on the major changes, including the classification of the devices, as it might have a significant impact on the way legal manufacturers will be able to apply and continue to apply the CE marking on its devices. And then finally, we'll discuss. So this is just a snapshot of the formal process for the lawmaking and the different steps between the first proposal from the European Commission and the issuance of the regulation. For the new IVDR, the Commission adopted its proposal for a new regulation replacing the current Directive 9879 EC on in vitro diagnostics medical devices on the 26th of September in 2012. The Council of the European Union voted on March 7th of 2017, followed shortly by the European Parliament vote, which happened just recently on March 20th of 2017. So now we can safely assume that the final publication for both the medical device regulation and the in vitro diagnostics regulation will be released in May or possibly June of 2017. Arising from the lawmaking process, there are three categories of European laws that have binding force. Those would be regulations, directives, and decisions. For in vitro diagnostic devices and medical devices, we're switching from a directive to a regulation. So the reason for this is it allows us to have a more uniform application throughout the Union. Regulations are binding on member states and require no national measures for implementation. We also need to note that they do, however, normally need a member state legislation to specify the applicable competent and enforcement authorities and to set penalties for noncompliance. The decision to regulate the medical devices through a regulation will also avoid differences in national interpretation that can lead to uneven implementation of the directive. They should further strengthen patient safety through the introduction of more stringent procedures for conformity assessment and for post-market surveillance, and through requirements for manufacturers to generate clinical data providing evidence on safety, performance, and any undesirable side effects. They should also allow for rapid and cost-efficient market access for innovative medical devices. So the major changes from the directive to the regulation include the definition and scope of IVD. There is a much wider and broader scope. The UDI, or Unique Device Identification System. There's a new classification system for devices. There are new provisions on conformity assessment. There are also new requirements for clinical data and much more prescriptive requirements for vigilance and market surveillance. There is a minor change to the definition of the IVD in the regulation, specifically the underlined portions noted here. So you'll notice that software has been specifically called out in the decision. Congenital abnormality has been clarified to specify physical or mental impairments. These are noted by the two underlined sections concerning the predisposition to a medical condition or a disease and to predict treatment response or reactions. These have both been added. And finally, clarification to define, not just monitor, therapeutic measures. So first we'll start with the IVD definition and scope. To a large extent, the scope of the new regulation actually matches the scope of Directive 9879 EC. So it covers in vitro diagnostics medical devices. The proposed changes clarify and extend the scope of the IVD directive, and these changes concern high-risk devices manufactured and used within a single health institution, which are subject to most of the requirements set out in the proposal. Tests providing information about the predisposition to a medical condition or a disease, these would be genetic tests, and tests providing information to predict treatment response or reactions, these will be your companion diagnostics, which are considered as in vitro diagnostic medical devices. And finally, medical device software, which again is explicitly mentioned in the definition of the IVDs. Next is unique device identifiers. So, provisions regarding registration of devices and economic operators, in particular those governing the unique device identification system, have been complemented and clarified. They should lead to the establishment of a more functional system related to identification and traceability of devices, while maintaining alignment with international principles and practices in the field. So, for anyone that works under the current FDA regulation, the concept of UDI is probably nothing new. However, the concept of UDI is new to the European framework. The purpose of the UDI system is to establish a more functional system related to identification and traceability of devices. UDI will consist of the UDI DI, which is specific to a manufacturer and a device, a UDI production identifier, or a UDI PI, that identifies the unit of device production and, if applicable, the packaged devices. UDI will result in label changes as it is required to appear on any packaging or labeling. Storage of UDI. What this means is that economic operators will store the UDI, preferably electronically, of certain categories of devices with which they have either been supplied or with they have actually supplied. Member states may also require health institutions and professionals to store UDIs of the devices that they have been supplied with as well. One or several entities will be designated to operate a system for assignment of the UDIs, and we'll provide more information on these entities either through client bulletins, newsletters, or future webinars as it becomes available. But the most important thing to remember is that the UDI has to be used for reporting serious incidents and any field safety corrective actions. The classification system of the regulation has been adapted to correspond to the rapid increase in scientific, medical, and technical knowledge and to the resulting development of more and more advanced devices. The provisions on conformity assessment have been clarified, but continue to be based on the existing well-established system. Thereby, the provisions on assessment of high-risk devices have been considerably strengthened with a focus on patient safety. So here you'll see a list of the current classification scheme within the IVD directive. In the regulation, as per the directive, the classification criteria and rules will be defined in a specific annex. In the regulation, this is now Annex 8. Also, the conformity assessment pathway will continue to be based on the device class. In the current directive, the classification of IVD devices is described in Annex 2. Annex 2, as you know, has been highly criticized as being random and not scientifically based. It also denies room for changes and emerging technology. The regulation introduces a new risk-based rule classification system based on the Global Harmonization Task Force classification rules. The new classifications will fall into category D, C, B, or A, with D being the highest risk products and A being those with the lowest risk. So we'll start with the highest risk devices first, which will be your Class D devices, which are blood screening according to Classification Rule 1. These are devices intended to be used to detect the presence of or exposure to a transmissible agent in blood, blood components, cells, tissues, or organs, or any of their derivatives. A transmissible agent that causes a life-threatening disease with a high or current undefined risk of propagation. Determining the infectious load of a life-threatening disease where monitoring is critical to the process of patient management. And, of course, your blood grouping systems. Class C devices under Rule 2 are devices intended to be used for blood grouping or tissue typing to ensure the immunocompatibility of blood, blood components, cells, tissue, or organs that are intended for transfusion or transplantation or cell administration. And the exception for this is when it's intended to determine the previously mentioned Class D blood grouping devices. For Class C Rule 3, these are devices intended for the detection or the presence of or exposure to a sexually transmitted agent, detecting the presence in cerebrospinal fluid or blood of an infectious agent with a risk of limited propagation, detecting the presence of an infectious agent if there is a significant risk that an erroneous result would cause death or severe disability to the individual or fetus, or to the individual's offspring, and prenatal screening of women in order to determine their immune status towards transmissible agents. This is a continuation of Class C, Rule 3, for determining infective disease status or immune status, where there is a risk that an erroneous result would lead to a patient management decision resulting in a life-threatening situation for the patient or for the patient's offspring, to be used as a companion diagnostic, to be used for disease staging, where there is a risk that an erroneous result would lead to patient management decision resulting in life-threatening situation for the patient or for the patient's offspring, to be used in screening, diagnosis, or staging of cancer, and for human genetic testing. Class C, Rule 3, for monitoring of levels of medicinal products, substances, or biological components when there is a risk that an erroneous result will lead to a patient management decision resulting in a life-threatening situation for the patient or the patient's offspring. For management of patients suffering from a life-threatening disease or condition. For screening for congenital disorders for the embryo or the fetus. And for screening for congenital disorders in newborn babies where failure to detect or treat such disorders could lead to life-threatening situations or severe disabilities. Class C, Rule 4, is devices intended for self-testing with the exception of those that fall under Rule 4 of Class B. Those are detection of pregnancy, for fertility testing, and for determining cholesterol levels, and devices for the detection of glucose, erythrocytes, leukocytes, and bacteria in urine, which are all classified as Class B. For devices intended for near-patient testing, these are classified in their own right. For Class B, Rule 6, devices not covered by the above-mentioned classification rules are classified as Class B. According to Rule 7, devices which are controls without a quantitative or qualitative assigned value are classified as Class B. For Class A devices, this includes products for general laboratory use, accessories which possess no critical characteristics. These would be items like buffer solutions, wash solutions, or general culture media. Reagents or other articles with specific characteristics. Instruments intended specifically for use in IVD procedures, and finally, specimen receptacles. And this is just a graphic overview of the various rules along with the resulting classification for each product. The provisions on conformity assessment have been clarified, but continue to be based on the existing system. Here you have an overview of the current conformity assessment routes available to manufacturers per the current directive. Here you will see a very brief overview of choices for conformity assessment. For manufacturers of Class A devices, other than devices for performance study, they shall declare the conformity of their products by issuing the Declaration of Conformity. However, if those devices are placed on the market in sterile condition, the manufacturer shall apply the procedures set out in Annex 9 or in Annex 11. Manufacturers of Class B devices shall be subject to conformity assessment as specified in Chapters 1 and 3 of Annex 9. This is an assessment of the full quality management system and an assessment of technical documentation for at least one representative device per category of devices. For self-testing and near-patient testing, the manufacturer shall follow the procedure for assessment of technical documentation set out in Section 5.1 of Annex 9. Manufacturers of Class C devices shall be subject to a conformity assessment as specified in Annex 9, and including an assessment of the technical documentation for at least one representative device per category of devices. Alternatively, they may choose Annex 10, type examination, coupled with Annex 11, an assessment of the production quality. For companion diagnostics, a consultation with the competent authority is required for every device. Manufacturers of Class D clinical evidence. Clinical evidence requirements will have to be collected for IVD devices. Clinical evidence is defined as clinical data and performance evaluation results pertaining to the device of sufficient amount and quality to allow a qualified assessment of whether the device achieves the intended clinical benefit and safety when used as intended by the manufacturer. The new regulation makes the need for clinical data and performance evaluation more explicit and prescriptive. The performance evaluations are based on the assessment and analysis of data to establish or verify the scientific validity, analytical performance, and clinical performance. Per the new regulation, manufacturers must develop a plan and procedures to continuously perform and document performance evaluations, with prescriptive frequency required for IVD devices that are high-risk classes. Performance studies are the equivalent of clinical trials in the new regulation. Clinical performance studies for all IVD devices, including self-test devices, will have to identify investigators, investigation sites, criteria and procedures for suspension or early termination of the studies, as well as criteria and procedures for follow-up clinical trials. According to this provision, the manufacturer or its sponsor only needs to make a single application, which will then be submitted to all concerned member states, but coordinated by one member state. The decision made by this coordinating member state will be adopted by all concerned states. A performance study plan to define rationale, objectives, design, and other aspects of the study will be required along with a final report, which will include the study plan, results, and the conclusions. The requirements for clinical. The last major change covered in this webinar is concerning vigilance and market surveillance. The provisions on vigilance and market surveillance have been strengthened. Post-market surveillance in itself is nothing new, but there are more prescriptive measures now laid out in the new regulation. Data gathered by the manufacturer's post-market surveillance system shall in particular be used to update the benefit risk determination and to improve the risk management as referred to in Chapter 1 of Annex 1, to update the design and manufacturing information, the instructions for use and the labeling, to update the performance evaluation, to update the summary of safety and performance referred to in Article 29, for the identification of needs for preventive, corrective, or field safety corrective actions, for the identification of options to improve the usability, performance, and safety of the devices, when relevant, to contribute to the post-market surveillance of other devices, and also to detect and report trends in accordance with Article 83. The post-market surveillance system must be based on a post-market surveillance plan, which will be part of the technical documentation. Manufacturers of Class A and B devices must prepare a post-market surveillance report summarizing the results and conclusions of the analysis of the post-market surveillance data gathered as a result of the post-market surveillance plan. This must also include rationale and description of any preventive and corrective actions taken. The report needs to be updated and made available to the notified body and the competent authority upon request. Manufacturers of Class C and Class D devices must prepare a periodic safety update report. This report must also include the requirements of the PMS report. However, it must also include the conclusions of the benefit risk determination, the main findings of the post-market performance follow-up, the volume of sales of the device, and an estimate of the size and other characteristics of the population using the device, and where practical, the usage frequency of the device. The safety report must be updated annually and included in the technical documentation. For Class D devices, the periodic safety update report must be submitted to the notified body electronically for evaluation. For Class C devices, the safety report must be made available to the notified body and competent authority upon request. Manufacturers not only have to report serious incidents and field safety corrective actions, they must also report any statistically significant increase in the frequency or severity of incidents that are not serious incidents that could have a significant impact on the benefit risk analysis and which have led or may lead to unacceptable risks to the health or safety of the patients, users, or any other people, or significant increase in expected erroneous results established in comparison to the stated performance of the device and specified in the technical documentation and product information. How to manage the incidence methodology used for determining any statistical significant increase and the observation period must be included in the post-market plan. The competent authorities may conduct their own assessments on the trend reports. An electronic system will exist for manufacturers to report serious incidents and field safety corrective actions. Also, trend reports, as noted in the previous bullet point, will be submitted through this electronic system. Other submissions will include the periodic safety update reports, field safety notices, and any information that needs to be exchanged between competent authorities. The system shall include relevant links to the UDI database. Healthcare professionals and the public will have appropriate access. Of course, this is a very, very brief overview of vigilance and post-market surveillance, and I highly encourage you to read through the regulation in order to plan integration with your own systems and processes. UTIMED. As UTIMED was previously discussed, I won't go into too many details. However, one of the key aspects in fulfilling the obligation of this regulation and the medical device regulation is the creation of the UTIMED database. The objectives of the database are to enhance overall transparency, including better access to information for the public and healthcare professionals, and to avoid multiple reporting requirements. Ideally, UTIMED should integrate the vigilance reporting system, the performance evaluation database, the UDI information, and so on. So what's next for the manufacturer? It is important to note that there will be no grandfathering allowed. All products on the market must be compliant by the end of the transition period, regardless of its market history. The transition for IVD will end in 2022. That is a 5-year transition, unlike the medical device regulation, which is a 3-year transition. We advise you to ensure the correct classification of your product per the new regulation, and as a result, you must choose an appropriate conformity assessment. And then the last step would definitely be to contact your notified body to discuss any plans for your transition. If you have any questions on this presentation, please contact us at contact@lne-america.com. And on behalf of Sam Shakir and myself, Sheena Bond, I'd like to thank you for joining us for this group webinar on the MDR and IVD regulations. Thank you.